The first insult came at exactly 9:42 p.m., loud enough for half the room to hear. Vincent Cardon, a real estate developer with more money than manners, had just called Jean Martin a trophy wife who probably couldn't spell her own last name. He said it with a smile. He said it like it was a compliment. And he said it while Dean Martin was standing less than 15 feet away, adjusting his cufflinks near the stage entrance. Dean heard every word. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just kept working the cufflink on his left wrist, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. The Sands Hotel showroom was packed that night. High rollers, Hollywood producers, women in furs, men in $1,000 suits. The kind of crowd that pretended not to notice when something ugly happened right in front of them. Jean had been sitting at a small table near the bar, waiting for Dean's set to start. She was alone. That was her mistake. According to Vincent, he'd walked up to her table uninvited, drink in hand, and made himself comfortable in the chair across from her. She'd been polite at first. Cold but polite. That wasn't enough for him. Vincent leaned back in his chair, gestured to his crew at the bar, 3 men in dark suits who watched everything and said nothing, and then turned his attention back to Jean. That's when he said it, the trophy wife line. Jean's face went tight. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The insult hung in the air like cigarette smoke, thick and unavoidable. A waiter nearby heard it. His name was Tommy, 23 years old, worked at the Sands for 8 months. He was carrying a tray of champagne glasses, and when he heard Vincent's words, his hands started shaking. Just slightly, just enough that the glasses trembled. He knew who Jean Martin was. Everyone did. And he knew what he was hearing was wrong. Every instinct told him to say something, to step in. But Vincent Cardon was a regular, a big tipper, the kind of guest management loved, and Tommy had rent to pay, a mother back in Ohio who needed help with medical bills. So he looked down at his tray and kept walking. The glasses stopped shaking, but his hands didn't. A couple at the next table heard it too. Robert and Diane Castellano, married 27 years. Robert was a lawyer, the kind of man who made his living standing up in courtrooms and arguing for what was right. He heard Vincent insult Jean Martin, and something in his chest tightened. He opened his mouth, started to turn in his chair. Diane's hand landed on his wrist, firm, final. Her eyes said it all. Don't. It's not our business. Robert closed his mouth, turned back to his drink, and hated himself just a little bit for it. At the bar, Vincent's 3 men watched the whole thing unfold. The one on the left, a man named Paulie, had a sister who'd been harassed at work last year. He'd wanted to kill the guy. And now here he was, watching his own boss do the exact same thing to another man's wife, and he was doing nothing. But Vincent signed the checks. So he took another sip of his bourbon and looked away. The pianist kept playing. No one said a word. Would you have? Vincent wasn't finished. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, invading her space. I'm just saying, a woman like you don't need to sit here waiting on a man who's too busy being a celebrity to take care of his wife. You could do better. You could be with someone who actually shows up. Jane's hands were folded in her lap, perfectly still. But inside, a different conversation was happening. She'd been here before, not this exact situation, but close enough. She'd grown up in a world where men thought they could say anything to women and get away with it, where being beautiful was treated like an invitation, where saying no was considered rude, but being harassed was considered normal. She'd learned early to keep her face calm, to never let them see the anger, because anger gave them power. So she kept her hands folded, kept her face neutral, and waited. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, controlled. "My husband is performing tonight. That's why I'm waiting." Vincent laughed. It was a cruel sound. "Performing, right? You mean singing a couple songs while drunk off his ass? Sweetheart, that's not a job. That's a hobby." One of his men at the bar chuckled. Not loud. Just enough. Jean looked past Vincent, searching for anyone who might step in. The room was full of people, important people, powerful people. Not one of them met her eyes. She was alone, completely alone, and Vincent knew it. He reached across the table and tapped his finger on the surface, right in front of her, like he was making a point to a child. You want my advice? Stop waiting. A man who makes you wait isn't worth your time." That's when Dean finally moved. He finished with the cufflink, straightened his jacket, and started walking, not toward Vincent, not toward Jean, toward the bar. Slow, casual, like he was just getting a drink before showtime. But something about the way he moved made people notice. Dean Martin didn't walk with the swagger of Sinatra, didn't command attention with volume or flash. His power was different, quieter. He moved through the world like a man who knew exactly what he was worth and didn't need to prove it to anyone. And when he decided to act, when he shifted from performer to protector, the change was almost invisible. Almost. The room didn't notice at first, but something about the way he didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge anyone, made a few people turn their heads. Tommy, the waiter, saw it. He watched Dean's face as he passed. There was no anger there, no visible emotion at all. But Tommy had grown up with 3 older brothers, and he knew what a man's face looked like right before he did something he couldn't take back. This was that face. Dean reached the bar and stood there, one hand resting on the polished wood. The bartender, a man named Lou who'd worked the sands for 12 years, saw Dean's face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Whiskey?" Lou asked. Dean shook his head. "Not yet." His voice was calm, soft, even. But there was something underneath it, something cold and final, like the sound of a door locking. Lou set the glass down and stepped back. Dean stayed at the bar. He didn't look at Vincent. He didn't look at Jean. He looked at the mirror behind the bottles, the one that reflected the entire room. And he waited. This was the thing people never understood about Dean Martin. They saw the easy smile, the casual charm, the guy who seemed like he never took anything seriously. But Dean had grown up in Steubenville, Ohio. Son of an Italian immigrant barber, he'd learned early that the world didn't hand you respect. You earned it. And you protected it. He'd also learned that there were 2 kinds of power. The loud kind that announced itself and demanded attention, and the quiet kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. Dean had spent his whole career building the second kind. You could mock his singing, call him a drunk, say he was riding Sinatra's coattails. He'd heard it all. He'd laugh it off. But his family, that was different. That was the line. And once you crossed it, there was no going back. Vincent, meanwhile, was still talking. "You know what your problem is?" he said to Jean, louder now, playing to the audience he knew was listening. "You married a man who thinks he's Frank Sinatra. But he's not. He's the guy who stands next to Frank Sinatra. There's a difference." Jean stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. She didn't say anything. She just picked up her purse and started to walk away. Vincent grabbed her wrist, not hard, not violent, but firm enough to stop her, firm enough to make it clear. "Hey," he said, still smiling. "I'm talking to you." The room went silent. Not the kind of silence where people stop talking. The kind where people stop breathing. Every eye in the showroom turned toward that table. Tommy the waiter froze mid-step. Robert Castellano's hand tightened around his glass. Paulie at the bar felt his stomach drop, because they all knew, they all understood. Vincent had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Jean looked down at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked at his face. Her voice was ice. "Let go." Vincent's smile faded. Just a little, just enough to show that he'd heard the steel in her voice. But he didn't let go. "Or what?" he said. "You gonna call your husband? Where is he, anyway?" Dean's voice came from across the room, quiet and clear. "Right here." Vincent's head snapped toward the bar. Dean was still standing there, one hand on the bar top, the other in his pocket. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. But every person in that room heard him. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vincent let go of Jean's wrist, slowly, like he was doing her a favor. "There he is," Vincent said, turning in his chair. "The man of the hour. I was just keeping your wife company. You're welcome." Dean didn't respond. He just looked at Vincent, that was all. Just looked. And Vincent, for the first time that night, felt something shift in the air. He cleared his throat, straightened his jacket, tried to laugh it off. "No offense, Dean. Just having a little fun. You know how it is." Dean finally moved. He walked toward the table. Same slow pace, same calm expression. But now people were watching. Now the entire room understood that something was happening. When he reached Jean, he didn't touch her, didn't ask if she was okay. He just stood next to her, close enough that she could feel his presence, and kept his eyes on Vincent. "You done?" Dean asked. Vincent blinked. "What?" "I asked if you're done." Vincent laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Nervous?" "Come on, Dean. Don't be like that. I was just talking to the lady. No harm, no foul." Dean tilted his head slightly, like he was considering something. Then he spoke again, and his voice dropped even lower. "Stand up." Vincent's smile disappeared. "Excuse me, stand up." The showroom was frozen. Vincent looked around, looking for support, looking for someone to back him up. His 3 men at the bar didn't move. Paulie was staring at his drink like it was the most interesting thing in the world. The couple at the next table stared at their plates. The waiter had disappeared into the kitchen. Vincent was alone. And he knew it. He stood up slowly. Dean stepped closer. Not enough to touch, just enough to make Vincent have to look up slightly. Dean was taller, leaner, but in that moment he seemed to take up the entire room. "You put your hands on my wife," Dean said. It wasn't a question. Vincent started to speak. Dean held up one finger, just one. Vincent's mouth snapped shut. "You insulted her," Dean continued. "You made her uncomfortable. You made her feel small. In my town, in my venue, at my show." He paused. Let the words settle. Then he leaned in just an inch and spoke so quietly that only Vincent and the people closest could hear. "That was a mistake." Vincent swallowed. His face had gone pale. The swagger, the confidence, the power he'd walked in with, all of it was draining away like water from a cracked glass. He tried to recover. "Look, Dean, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke. You know how it is. Guys talk. I didn't think." "That's the problem," Dean said, cutting him off. "You didn't think." Dean turned his head slightly, not looking away from Vincent, and raised his voice just enough to be heard across the room. "Lou." The bartender straightened up. "Yeah, Dean." "Call Jack and Tratter. Tell him we've got a situation." Jack Entratter, the president of the Sands Hotel, the man who decided who was welcome in Vegas and who wasn't. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Vincent's eyes went wide. The color drained completely from his face. "Wait, Dean. Come on. That's not necessary. I'll leave. I'll go right now." "No problem." Dean didn't respond. He just stood there waiting. Lou picked up the phone behind the bar. The sound of the dial tone echoed in the silence. Every person in that room heard it, and every person understood what it meant. This wasn't just about one night. This was about consequences, real consequences, the kind that followed you. Vincent took a step back, then another. His men at the bar stood up, uncertain, looking at each other, silently asking what they were supposed to do. None of them had an answer. "Dean," Vincent said, his voice cracking, "please, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I made a mistake. Just let me go. I won't come back. I swear." Dean looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Jean. "You okay?" She nodded. Her voice was steady. "I'm fine." Dean turned back to Vincent. "She's fine," he said, "but you're not." Those 4 words landed like a judge's gavel. Final. Irreversible. Jack Entratter walked into the showroom 3 minutes later. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He took one look at the scene. Vincent standing there sweating, Dean standing calm and still, Jane sitting back down at her table, and he understood immediately. "What happened?" Jack asked. Dean didn't answer. He just looked at Vincent. Vincent tried to speak, but nothing came out. Jack turned to Lou. "Lou." The bartender nodded toward Vincent. He put his hands on Mrs. Martin, insulted her, made a scene. Jack's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went hard. He turned to Vincent and said one word. "Oat." Vincent opened his mouth to argue. Jack held up a hand. "Oat, now and don't come back. Not to this hotel. Not to any hotel I'm involved with. You're done in this town." Vincent's face went red, then white. He looked around the room one more time, desperate, searching for someone who might help him. No one moved. No one spoke. The 3 men who'd come in with him were already edging toward the exit. He turned and walked toward the door. When he reached it, he paused, just for a second, like maybe he was going to turn around. He didn't. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and that was it. He was gone. The room exhaled. Conversation started up again. The pianist began to play. Waiters moved between tables. It was like someone had hit the play button after a long pause. But it wasn't the same. Something had changed. Tommy the waiter delivered his tray and realized his hands were shaking again. This time it wasn't fear. Robert Castellano looked at his wife and said, very quietly, "I should have said something." Diane squeezed his hand. Her eyes told him she agreed. From that night forward, he'd be different. He'd speak up. One failure changed him. Paulie finished his drink, left a 20 on the bar, and walked out without saying goodbye. He'd find a new boss. Someone he could respect, because money wasn't worth this shame. Dean sat down at the table across from Jean. He didn't say anything, just reached across and took her hand. She squeezed it once. Hard. That was all. Jack walked over, hands in his pockets. "You okay, Jean?" "I'm fine, Jack. Thank you." Jack nodded. Then he looked at Dean. "You still going on tonight?" Dean smiled for the first time. That easy, lazy smile that made women melt and men want to buy him a drink. Wouldn't miss it. Jack clapped him on the shoulder and walked away. Dean stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward the stage. The band started warming up. The lights dimmed. And when Dean stepped up to the microphone, the applause was thunderous. But before he started singing, he paused, looked out at the crowd, and said very simply, "Thanks for coming tonight. And remember, if you can't be kind, at least be quiet." The room erupted in laughter and applause. Dean launched into his first song, smooth and effortless, like nothing had happened. But everyone in that room knew they'd just witnessed something. Not a fight, not a scene, something quieter, something more dangerous. They'd seen a man protect what was his without raising his voice, without throwing a punch, without making a threat. And they'd seen what happened when you crossed that line. The show that night was one of Dean's best. He was loose, charming. He told jokes between songs, flirted with the women in the front row, made fun of himself. The audience loved it. They always did. But the people who'd been there earlier, the ones who'd seen what happened before the show, they watched him differently. They saw the steel underneath the smile. They understood that the easygoing, carefree persona was a choice, and that when Dean chose differently, when he decided to stop playing the clown and start being the man, he was more dangerous than anyone in that room. After the last song, after the final bow, after the lights came up, people lingered. They didn't want to leave. They stood around in small groups, talking in low voices, replaying what they'd seen, trying to understand it. Tommy the waiter heard snippets of conversation as he cleared tables. "Did you see his face? I've never seen Dean like that. That guy's finished in this town. Good. He had it coming." One woman, a regular at the Sands, said something that stuck with Tommy. She said, "That's the difference between a man and a boy. A boy makes noise. A man makes moves." Her companion nodded. Dean didn't have to do anything. He just had to be Dean. And that was it. That was the whole thing. Dean Martin didn't need to flex, didn't need to posture, didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He'd spent 20 years building relationships, building trust, building the kind of reputation that made one phone call more powerful than 100 threats. And when the moment came, when it mattered, all of that paid off. After the show that night, Dean and Jean walked out of the Sands together, hand in hand. No security, no entourage, just the two of them, walking through the casino floor like any other couple. People stepped aside to let them pass, not because they were afraid, because they respected what they'd seen. A man who protected his wife, a woman who stood her ground, a couple who reminded everyone in that room what loyalty actually looked like. They got into their car and drove home in silence. When they got there, Dean poured himself a drink, sat down in his favorite chair, looked at Jean and said, "You sure you're okay?" She smiled, the first one since 9:42 p.m. "I'm sure." He nodded, took a sip, and never mentioned it again. But Vegas remembered. The next morning, word spread through Vegas like wildfire. Not just among the tourists, among the people who actually ran the city, the dealers, the pit bosses, the hotel managers, the casino owners. Everyone heard the same story. Vincent Cardone had crossed Dean Martin, and Dean had made one phone call, and Vincent was done, finished, blacklisted. The story grew with each telling. People added details, embellished moments, but the core remained the same. Dean Martin didn't need to fight. He didn't need to yell. He just needed to make a phone call, and that was more terrifying than any threat. Within 6 hours, Vincent's name was on a list. A real list. The kind that got passed around to every major casino on the Strip. The Flamingo, the Tropicana, the Riviera, the Dunes. By the end of the day, Vincent Cardone couldn't get a drink in any respectable establishment in Las Vegas. By the end of the week, His business partners started backing out of deals. Phone calls went unreturned. Meetings got canceled. Contracts fell through. By the end of the month, he'd sold his Vegas properties at a loss and moved back east. He never set foot in Nevada again. The story became a legend, a warning, a reminder for years afterward when someone new came to town, someone with money and ego and a sense of entitlement. The old-timers would tell them the story. They'd sit at the bar, order a round, and say, "Let me tell you about the time a guy thought he could mess with Dean Martin's wife." And they'd tell the whole thing, every detail, every moment. And at the end, they'd always finish with the same line. Dean didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't touch the guy, just made a phone call, and that was it. Game over. In a town where everyone was hustling, where loyalty was rare and betrayal was common, where people stepped on each other to get ahead, Dean Martin had drawn a line. And everyone knew it. You could gamble at his casino, drink at his bar, watch his show, but you couldn't disrespect his family. Not even once. Because if you did, you'd learn the same lesson Vincent Carden learned, that the quietest man in the room is often the most dangerous. That real power doesn't need to announce itself. And that some mistakes don't get second chances. Jane never talked about that night publicly. But years later, in a private conversation with a close friend, she said something that stuck. She said, "Dean didn't do it for the crowd. He didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because if he didn't, I'd have to keep walking into rooms wondering if it would happen again. He made sure I never had to wonder." That's what people miss when they talk about that night. They focus on Vincent, on what he lost, on whether the punishment fit the crime. But the real story isn't about Vincent at all. It's about Jean, about a woman who was disrespected and humiliated in a room full of people who should have known better, and about a man who made sure she never felt that way again. Dean didn't give a speech, didn't make a scene, didn't lecture anyone about respect or decency. He just acted. One phone call, one quiet conversation, one irreversible decision. And the message was clear. You can insult Dean Martin all you want. He's heard worse. He's been called a drunk, a has-been, a Sinatra knockoff. He's been ridiculed and dismissed and underestimated his whole career. He can take it. But his wife, that's a different story. That's the line. And if you cross it, there's no coming back. So here's the question. If you'd been in that room that night, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in when Vincent first sat down uninvited? Would you have said something when he grabbed Jean's wrist? Or would you have looked away, like everyone else, and told yourself it wasn't your business? Because that's the other side of this story. Vincent was the villain. Dean was the hero. But what about everyone else? The waiter who heard the insult and kept walking. The couple at the next table who looked away. The men at the bar who watched their boss cross a line and said nothing. They're part of this too. Silence isn't neutral. Looking away isn't innocence. When you see something wrong and you do nothing, you've made a choice. You've taken a side. And that night at the Sands, a room full of people chose wrong. They chose comfort over courage. They chose not to get involved. And it took Dean Martin, a guy who just wanted to sing some songs and go home to his wife, to remind them what the right choice looked like. He didn't do it with a speech. Didn't do it with a lecture. He did it with action. Quiet, irreversible, final. And 30 years later, people are still talking about it. Because that's what happens when you stand up for something that matters. When you draw a line and refuse to let anyone cross it. When you choose loyalty over popularity, principle over profit, action over apology, you become a story, a legend, a reminder of what's possible when you stop worrying about what people think and start caring about what's right. Dean Martin understood that. He lived it. And on that night in 1961, in a showroom packed with people who thought they'd seen everything, he showed them something they'd never forget. Not a fight, not a scandal, just a man protecting his wife and the whole world that came crashing down on someone who thought he was too big to fall. Vincent Cardone learned that lesson the hard way, and Las Vegas never forgot it. The story still circulates in Vegas today, still gets told at bars and card tables, still serves as a warning to anyone who thinks money makes them untouchable. Because it doesn't. Power isn't about how loud you are. It's about what you do when it matters. It's about the lines you draw and the people you protect. It's about being the kind of person who doesn't need to make threats because everyone already knows you'll follow through. Dean Martin was that kind of person. And on one night in 1961, he proved it. Without raising his voice, without throwing a punch, without making a scene, just one phone call. That's all it took. One phone call to remind everyone in that room what real power looked like, what real loyalty meant, what real strength demanded. And the lesson stuck for Vincent Cardone, for Tommy the waiter, for Robert Castellano, for Paulie, for everyone who was there that night. They learned that being a bystander isn't the same as being innocent, that looking away is a choice, that silence has consequences. And they learned that sometimes one person doing the right thing is enough to change everything.